Some trust in the chariot.
We trust in the name of the Lord our God.
Some trust in horses.
We trust in the name of the Lord our God. So good. God is so good. God is so good. He's so good to me. He saved my soul. He saved my soul. He saved my soul. He's so good to me. He answers prayer. He answers prayer. He answers prayer. He's so good to me. He's coming back. He's coming back. He's coming back. He's so good to me. God is so good. God is so good. God is so good. He's so good to me.
The heavens declare the glory of God. The sky above proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours out speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words, whose voice is not heard. Their voice goes out throughout all the earth, their words to the end of the world. In them he has set a tent for the sun, which comes out like a bridegroom leaving his chamber, and like a strong man runs its course with joy. Its rising from the end of the heavens, and its circuit to the end of them, for there is nothing hidden from its heat.
Well, good evening. Thank you for joining us. We are coming to you on this Wednesday night virtually, primarily because of potential weather problems, but we hope you're safe tonight, and we hope that you are able to make it through the weather and you don't have anything happen really bad. And if there's something you need help with, please let some of us know. We'll be glad to help you any way that we can. Well, on my lesson for tonight, I think one of my favorite topics to talk about is nature, astronomy, biology, and things that of God's creation. So here's what I've titled tonight's lesson: God's unbelievable, believable creation. Now, why do I say that? Here's why. It's almost unbelievable at what God has done in the creation of the earth, all things on the earth, the heavens above us, but yet it's believable because God did it, and He's told us He did it in His Word. Let's look at a few things tonight that may be of interest to you. I hope it is. The first thing I want you to think about with me is when I walk out at night, and I see the stars, what do I think about? Well, one thing, when I look at Psalm 147 and verse number 4, here's what was said by the psalmist a long time ago. This talking about God, He counts the number of the stars and gives names to all of them. Isn't that fascinating that God has names for all the stars? You and I know what some of the names of the stars are. We see them quite often at night when we're out on good clear nights. One of the things I love to do most is go out on clear nights and be able to just maybe either lay down somewhere or sit down and look up at the sky and just think about God's creation. I have in my mind that David did that. I think David, as a young shepherd boy, did that a lot, going out and looking up at the stars and thinking about God's creation. Think about some facts for just a moment. Here are some just fascinating things. On a good clear night, your naked eye has the ability to see around 2,000 to 2,500 stars. Now that's not near all of them. There's many, many more stars than that. I doubt that we know how many stars there are, but I'm sure there's many, many more. Our sun itself is a star. The sun is 93 million miles away from us. Isn't it fascinating to think, and scientists have determined this, that if the sun was any closer to us than it is, and obviously it is closer at different times because of the Earth's the rotation, that it would be, or it revolving around the sun, that we might either freeze to death or we might burn up. It's fascinating to think that God's power and His might has placed the sun in such a place as this so that it's to our benefit and it provides for us. That's divine. That is a divine way that God has provided for us. The Milky Way, which is where we live in, the stars that we see, what is named the Milky Way, it is said there's over 200 to 400 billion stars in the Milky Way. That's fascinating to me. The nearest star to us, not considering the sun being a star, is 4.2 light years away. Now, a light year is a measurement of distance. In science, you would learn what a light year is. That equates to about 6 trillion miles from us to the nearest star. Isn't that fascinating to think how God has created all of that? It's just we have the heavens above us that we see, and then we have the heaven where God dwells. We only see the heavens in which we are able to visually see. We don't see God's residence. I want to read you this one verse back in the book of Genesis for just a moment. In the creation, you know, scientists so many times are just fascinated by things, and they come up with all these different theories about how creation took place, how things came into existence. Look back in the book of Genesis with me for just a moment in chapter 1. And then this is what God said. In verse 14, then God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night. And let there be signs, and for seasons, and for days and years. And let there be for lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light to the earth. And it was so. The moon and the sun, how they have such a powerful influence over us. The moon by night, the sun by day, the moon reflecting from the sun, giving us the moon that we see, the light that we have at night. Tidal waves have to do with the gravitational pull of the moon on the earth. It's just fascinating to think all the things. So when you go out at night and you look up and you think about the stars, you think about God's creation and how fascinating it is, how unbelievable it is, but yet it's believable. Well, the second thing I want to talk to you about for just a minute are the creatures that God has created in the earth. Oh, it's fascinating to read about creatures. When you go back in the book of Genesis as well, if you go to verse number 20 of chapter 1, this is what was said in the book of Genesis as Moses recorded. Then God said, "Let the waters teem with swarms of living creatures, and let the birds fly above the earth in the open expanse of the heavens." There it is, the creation beginning of creatures. Verse number 21 says, God created the great sea monsters and every living creatures that moves, in which the water swarmed after their kind, and every winged bird after its kind, and God saw it was good. Then God said, this is verse 24, then God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures after their kind, the cattle, the creeping things, the beasts of the earth, after their kind." And it was so. God made the beasts of the earth after their kind, and the cattle after their kind, and everything that creeps on the ground after its kind. And God said that it was good. Oh, how fascinating it is to think about God's creation. Let me turn with me for just a moment over to the book of Job. I love to read in the book of Job. It has got a lot of lessons that you can get from reading the book of Job. But if you want to read about dinosaurs and sea monsters, go to the book of Job, because God directly addresses that with Job. If you go to chapter 38, first of all, and you look at verse 4, this is what God, if you remember, this was a conversation between Job and God, because Job was having a faith problem even though he never completely lost it, but he certainly was having some questions of God about why all these things had happened to him. I can imagine it would be hard to kind of went through the things that Job did and not have some questions of God. Well, God had listened to that, and I think God finally said, "Okay, Job, I'm going to draw the line here, and I want you to understand some things that you may not understand." And the beginning of this to me is in verse 4 of 38, where God says to Job, "Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth?" All the things that God has done, and Job's questioning God, and God in essence is saying, "Job, I did this way before you came into existence, and so you just don't understand everything that's been done." But chapter 40, if you turn over to chapter 40 and chapter 41 in Job, both of those two chapters deal with great creatures that were on the earth. If you read in chapter 40 and you talk about what was called in verse 15, "Behold now the behemoth, which I have made as well as you, which eats grass like an ox. Behold now his strength in his loins, and his power in the muscles of his belly. He bends his tail like a cedar. His sinews of his thighs are knit together. His bones are tubes of bronze. His limbs are like the bars of iron." Those are traits about a great creature which lived a long time ago. It's not imaginary. It really happened. That would be the dinosaurs that I truly believe that we see bones of today that have been put back together, that have been discovered. They existed. Now, they existed in the time of Job because God's talking to Job about these. You know, it might be that we don't fully understand exactly when Job lived on this earth. My opinion has always been he lived prior to the flood. Now, I do not know if that's 100% true or not, but whenever it was, obviously, creatures existed at that time that were huge. Chapter 41 goes into talking about something that I've always basically said was a fire-breathing dragon, to be honest with you. Read in chapter 41 what it talks about. When you go over and it's called the Leviathan, and he talks about, can you catch it with a fishhook? That's verse 1. Can you put a rope in his nose? Can you pierce his jaw with a hook? Will he make supplications to you, or will he speak to you with soft words? Well, obviously, the answer to that was no, because he was a very dangerous creature. It goes on through there describing how the Leviathan was. And then one of the fascinating things to me is over in the latter part of in verse 17 and 18. Well, 17 says he sneezes flash forth light. His eyes are like the eyelids of the morning. Out of his mouth go burning torches. Sparks of fire leap forth. That, my friends, is what I believe was a fire-breathing dragon that we've always read about and believed, and people have thought through some type of mystical thing existed. Well, I truly believe it existed, and there are scientific reasons that a creature like this could, in fact, exhale fire because of the grasses and things it ate, because of rocks it would be in its throat to help be able to grind this stuff up, and the ability, and of course when you have a lot of vegetation, puts off a particular methane gas, and when these rocks are ground together, that will cause a spark, and that could have very easily been what caused this creature to put forth fire out of its mouth, the fire-breathing dragon. Is that not fascinating to think about the creatures that God created on earth? And even today, all the animals that we see, all the cattle that's around us, all the dogs that we love so much, people that have cats that love the cats, all the different animals that are around. Go to the zoo and it's fascinating to see all these creatures and to think that God created those. Noah dealt with so many of those on the ark a long time ago. So when I think about the fascinating creatures of God, they are truly unbelievable, but yet they're believable. Well, the next thing that I want to talk about for just a moment is nature itself. I'm thinking more about plants, things that God has created. Go back to Genesis with me just for a minute. Let's look at it in the account of creation again in chapter 1. And let's go to verses 11 and 12. Then God said, "Let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees on the earth bearing fruit after their kind, and with seed in them." And it was so. Then God brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed after their kind, and trees bearing fruit, with seed in them after their kind. And God saw that it was good. Think about the food that we eat and all the crops. Oh, farmers out in the Midwest especially, and some here grow so many crops that we enjoy eating. Vance enjoys gardening so much. About to be that time of the year. It's a fascinating thing to see things grow. Is it not amazing to you that how you plant a seed and it sprouts forth to bring something, a bigger plant up, that in fact is something that you can eat at one point? I thought about something just a minute. I thought about just the corn stalk itself. You have one seed that brings forth one stalk. When a stalk comes up, the average stalk of corn produces about 2 ears of corn. Each ear of corn will generally produce around 800 kernels. Now that's an average. If you have 800 kernels of corn, and on each ear, and you've got 2 ears off of a stalk, that would be 1,600 kernels of corn that's produced off of that one stalk. Well, let's assume a minute that you plant all 1,600 of those seeds, and let's just assume a minute they all come up. Well, imagine what happens then. 1,600 new stalks of corn times 2 ears on each one of those times 800 kernels would be equivalent to 2,560,000 kernels of corn. Well, that would be the second year of the crop. Now, let's go one step further. Let's assume on the third year that you have planted 2,560,000 kernels of corn in the ground. Each one of those produced a stalk with 2 ears that had roughly 800 kernels on each ear. That would produce somewhere around 4 billion stalks of corn. Now, that's kind of a little simple way of showing God's ability to produce. Does that not tell us how God provided for us and to be able to plant things and it to produce food? And there's so many more examples of things like that, how God has provided for us to be able to feed ourselves, feed the world. If we're good stewards of what God has given us, we certainly could feed the world without any problem. Think for a minute about, we're in the springtime now. Things are blooming, flowers are out. Obviously it causes pollen, causes some of us to have sometimes sinus infections, but think of the good thing here. All the bees are being able to pollinate by being able to take out pollen and it being able to be moved to a different place, and the good that it does. I think it's just fascinating to think about this time of the year and the growth of plants that's coming forth. Think about this a minute. I think this is fascinating to me. A little small creature of nature, an ant. I want you to see what is said in the book of Proverbs about the ant. If you go to Proverbs chapter 6 for just a moment, and hear what the wise writer of Proverbs had to say about the ant when making comparisons here. Chapter 6 and verses 6, 7, and 8, which having no, well, go back to 6, go to the ant, O sluggard, observe her ways and be wise, which having no chief, officer, or ruler, prepares her food in the summer and gathers her provisions in the harvest. Well, obviously, the writer was talking about how some people are lazy and some people don't take care of their families and they don't work like they should. He's making that comparison to an ant, a creature of God that takes care of itself. And it does so by finding its food, saving its food in the summer so that it can hibernate through the wintertime. That's what ants do. Well, when I think of nature, I think about God's unbelievable creation. Well, the next thing I want to talk about for just a moment is the human body. This will be the last thing we really talk about here, the human body itself. Can you not imagine how fascinating the human body is? I thought about things. Let me read to you Psalms chapter 139 for just a moment. Psalms 139, verses 13 and 14. This is what the writer said here. For you formed my inward parts. You wove me in my mother's womb. I will give you thanks, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Oh, how fascinating the human body is. You know, Dr. Christian, being a medical doctor, could talk to us all day long about things he's learned in his practice and in his schooling about the human body. Here are some things I just think is fascinating to me, and this is just a touch of the garment. Your body has about 60,000 to 100,000 blood vessels in it. If you laid all the blood vessels in your body end to end of one human body, it would go around the earth at least 3 times. Is that not fascinating to think that God has created in our bodies the ability for that to take place? 60% of our body is water. Your brain produces electricity to the degree that if you could capture that electricity, you could actually light up a light bulb. About a 12 to 25 watt light bulb would light up off of the electricity produced by your brain. Information from your brain travels to your arms and your legs at a rate of roughly 150 to 250 miles per hour. That's how fast, when you think about something, you're thinking about running, it is a split second or less by the time your brain thinks that till you've got the ability to go do it. That's what God has created. Oh, it's just in your brain is so complex. You think about all the computers of the world, and most of us are in the computer age now and we're dealing with things, but none of them even compare to what God has put in our brains and our ability to think, react, and to do. Well, our body is so important, but I guess the most important thing about our body, besides our ability compared to all the other creatures that God has created, we have feelings, we have emotions, but the most important thing is we have a soul. That's the one thing that God delegated to us as humans that does not exist in other creatures that He made. Well, I hope this maybe brings about a little bit of some thinking about God's creation, how fascinating it is. Oh, you can read so much in the Bible about God's creation. But my question to you tonight is, do you believe in God? Oh, how can anyone get up in the morning, see what we see, face what we face, smell what we smell, eat what we eat, and sometimes we have heartaches and problems, and us not believe in an almighty creator as God? Well, if you truly believe in God, you would obey God. And if you're not a Christian tonight, then seriously think about becoming one. There are people who will study with you to help you learn. You study for yourself. The Bible will teach you what you need to do to become a Christian if you'll sincerely read it and study it. But there are other folks very willing to reach out and help you in that thing. Please seek out people to help you study if necessary, but we want to help you understand more about God and help ourselves to more understand about God as we travel down life's pathway of being a Christian and obeying what God has provided for us. Thanks for joining us for our Wednesday night lesson tonight.
Some trust in the chariot.
We trust in the name of the Lord our God.
Some trust in horses.
We trust in the name of the Lord our God. We trust in the name of the Lord our God. We trust in the name of the Lord our God.
His love never fails. His name will always prevail.
We trust in the name of the Lord our God.
Some trust in the work they do.
We trust in the name of the Lord our God.
By His grace all the work is through.
We trust in the name of the Lord our God. We trust in the name of the Lord our God. We trust in the name of the Lord our God.
His love never fails. His name will always prevail.
We trust in the name of the Lord our God.
Some trust in the wealth of things.
We trust in the name of the Lord our God.
A name worth more than anything.
We trust in the name of the Lord our God. We trust in the name of the Lord our God. We trust in the name of the Lord our God.
His love never fails. His name will always prevail.
We trust in the name of the Lord our God. We trust in the name of the Lord our God. We trust in the name of the Lord our God.
His love never fails. His name will always prevail.
We trust in the name of the Lord